Warning: this video contains images that some may consider disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Safety protocols and guidelines exist for a reason. No matter how excessive we may think they are, it's still important to follow them. When things go according to plan, it doesn't really seem that important that they were followed because they didn't really do much. But when accidents happen, bypassing procedures does make a difference. And if your work is dangerous, those differences can be catastrophic. It can turn an incident from a close call into a disaster. Today, I'll be talking about one such incident with Louis Slotin and the Demon Corps. This is SOSAD, Stories of Survival and Death, a series where I talk about the people in horrific situations, their lives, and how they either survived or died in that situation. So if that interests you, please like and subscribe, and let's get into the video. Louis Alexander Slotin was born December 10th, 1910 in Winnipeg, Canada, to Israel and Sonia Slotin. His parents were Yiddish-speaking Jewish refugees who fled the pogroms of Russia. He was the oldest of 3 children. He had a younger brother named Sam and a younger sister named Bertha. He grew up in the North End neighborhood of Winnipeg, where there was a higher concentration of Eastern European immigrants. And he attended McCrae Elementary in St. John's High School and was known to be academically exceptional. Sam said he had an extreme intensity that allowed him to study for long hours. Louis attended the University of Manitoba at age 16, and he received the University Gold Medal in Physics and Chemistry. And he graduated with his Bachelor's of Science in Geology in 1932 and his Master's of Science in 1933. He then got a fellowship to study at King's College London under the supervision of the chair of the chemistry department. While at King's College, Louis got pretty good at boxing. He won the college's amateur bantamweight championship, and he joked with Sam that all he got for it was a black eye. Louis enjoyed messing with people, especially people who were a little bit more gullible. He gave the impression that he fought for the Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War as an anti-aircraft gunner, but then he was discharged when they found out how poor his eyesight was. This was even mentioned in a 1956 book about Manhattan Project scientists by Robert Junk, but Sam said later in an interview that he went for more of a walking tour in Spain and he did not participate in the war. Louis earned his PhD in physical chemistry in 1936 at the age of 25, and he won a prize for his thesis, an investigation into intermediate formation of unstable molecules during some chemical reactions. After graduating, he spent 6 months working as a special investigator for Dublin's Great Southern Railways, testing their rechargeable batteries on their Dublin-Bray line. And in 1937, he became a research associate for the University of Chicago. And he gained his first experience with nuclear chemistry, helping to build the first cyclotron, which is a type of particle accelerator in the Midwestern United States. From 1939 to 1940, Louis worked with Earl Evans, the head of the biochemistry department at the University of Chicago, to produce radiocarbon from the cyclotron. They used carbon-11 to demonstrate that plant cells have the capacity to use carbon dioxide for carbohydrate synthesis through carbon fixation. By 1942, Louis contributed to several papers in the field of radiobiology, and this caught the attention of the US government, and they invited him to join the Manhattan Project. He took the offer and he started off working in the production of plutonium, and then in December of 1944 he was moved to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico to work on the bomb physics group under Robert Breaker. Lewis's work at Los Alamos consisted of criticality testing, which brought fissile material to near critical levels in order to establish their critical mass values. And this was extremely risky because it had the potential of causing a nuclear chain reaction. These tests were referred to as tickling the dragon's tail because Richard Feynman, a theoretical physicist, compared the experiments to tickling the tail of a sleeping dragon. On July 16, 1945, Lewis assembled the core for Trinity, which was the first detonated atomic device, and he became known as the chief armorer of the United States for his expertise in assembling nuclear weapons. 21 and 24 days later, on August 6th and 9th, the two nuclear bombs called Little Boy and Fat Man were detonated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. And after that, the war pretty much ended, and so the other bomb cores were kept and used for further testing. On August 21st, 1945, Harry Daghlian, a 25-year-old lab assistant and one of Lewis's close friends and colleagues, was performing a critical mass experiment when he accidentally dropped a heavy tungsten carbide brick on a 14-pound plutonium-gallium bomb core called Rufus. Harry was irradiated with a large dose of neutron radiation, which alone might not have killed him, but then he was dealt additional doses of gamma radiation and beta burns while he was disassembling his experiment. He quickly collapsed with acute radiation sickness and was hospitalized at the Los Alamos Base Hospital, and Lewis went and visited him to spend time with his friend, and he was involved in the efforts to figure out the dosages that Harry received because Harry wasn't wearing his dosimetry badge. And then 25 days later, Harry died. Despite seeing what happened to Harry and knowing the dangers of radiation, Lewis was still known to cut corners or disregard safety protocol. He kind of had this sort of lax behavior about it. Just a few months after Harry's accident, Lewis exposed himself to radiation by going 6 feet underwater into the Clinton pile to repair an instrument instead of waiting an extra day for the reactor to be shut down. And he didn't wear his dosimetry badge, so again, the radiation that he received from that is unknown, but it didn't seem to be enough that it affected him. Like many of the other scientists in the Manhattan Project, Lewis showed disdain for his involvement after the war. He said, "I have become involved in the Navy tests, much to my disgust." During the war, it was basically a race to create nuclear weapons, and it seems that those involved understood why they had to do this, but they didn't like doing it. Lewis wanted to return to teaching and researching biophysics and radiobiology at the University of Chicago, but his assistance was still needed in the project. As he said, "I am one of the few left here who are experienced bomb putter-togetherers." But eventually he started training his replacement, Alvin Graves, and on May 21st, 1946, Lewis was doing a demonstration with Rufus, showing Alvin and 6 others, Samuel Klein, Marion C. Slickey, Dwight Young, Theodore Perlman, Reimer Schreiber, and Private Patrick Cleary, a criticality experiment that created the first steps of a fission reaction by placing 2 half spheres of beryllium around the core. The beryllium would reflect neutrons from the core back onto itself. And if there wasn't a gap between the two hemispheres, allowing some of those neutrons to escape, then it would cause the core to reach criticality and start a prompt critical nuclear chain reaction. To avoid this, spacers were placed between the hemispheres to create that gap. But the goal was to get as close to a reaction as possible without waking the dragon. However, Lewis had his own way of doing things that was outside of protocol. His preferred method was to take a flathead screwdriver and use that to separate the spheres while he held the top half through a thumb hold. Enrico Fermi, the creator of the first nuclear reactor, had previously warned Lewis that if you keep doing that, you'll be dead in a year. But Lewis had performed this experiment multiple times, and so I think he had a diminished sense of caution about it. He felt comfortable in doing it. So on May 21st, Lewis assembled the experiment and he lowered the top half of the sphere onto one side, onto the other half, and he lowered it onto the screwdriver. And then he would rotate the screwdriver to change the size of the gap between the spheres. And a Geiger counter would record the radioactivity. So he was demonstrating how changing the size of this gap changed the reactivity. At 3:20 p.m., he was attempting to slide the sphere down the screwdriver to get as close as he could to closing the gap without actually closing it when the screwdriver slipped and the gap closed. There was an instant blue glow, a wave of heat, and the Geiger counter went off the charts, and Lewis quickly took the top shell and threw it to the ground, ending the reaction. He had a sour taste in his mouth and a burning sensation in his left hand, and he said, "Well, that does it." He figured he had just been killed. The reaction had only lasted fractions of a second. Samuel, Patrick, Dwight, and Marion rushed to the east exit, taking about 5 seconds from the start of the reaction to get there, and Theodore, Raymer, Alvin, and Lewis ran up the north corridor back to the main lab. And when they got back to the main lab, Lewis started throwing up. After they got out of the lab, Dwight jumped behind an earth barricade and stayed there, and Samuel, Patrick, and Marion continued to the gate, and the guard opened the gate and they continued running up the road a little ways. After about a minute, Dwight looked up because he didn't see the others exit, and so he looked back into the lab from the end of the ramp and he didn't see anyone. So he went back to the main lab and met with the others there. Lewis called the hospital, and then he made one other phone call to his friend and colleague, Philip Morrison, and then he had the others return to the lab so that they could make a sketch of their positions so that they could calculate dosages received. No one had been wearing their dosimetry badges, which was another break of protocol. So Lewis tried to use a radiation detector on things in the room, but the detector was contaminated with radiation itself, so it wasn't giving accurate readings. Lewis asked Raymer to return to the lab to take the dosimetry badges out of the lead lockbox and place them on the assembly, but this wouldn't have given them any value information because it wasn't recording dosages during the event. So this only exposed Raymer to more radiation. But radiation can cause some vertigo and leave a person in no position for rational behavior. And so this probably sounded like a good idea at the time. The film badges that were supposed to be around the room to monitor radiation were also not in place. So the actual dosages that everyone received is not known, but we do have some good estimates. On the way to the hospital, Lewis threw up again, and he told one of them, I'm not sure who though, that you'll be okay, but I think I'm done for. They were all admitted into the hospital within an hour, and Lewis, once there, again reiterated his sense of doom to Alvin, who was in the same ward as he was, saying, I'm sorry I got you into this. I'm afraid I only have a 50% chance of living. I hope you have better than that. The nurses took vitals and blood samples, and around 6 p.m., Dr. Wright Langham, a radiation biologist, came to gather metallic belongings from the men in order to calculate radiation dosages. And Lewis had worked with Harry to calculate these dosages for him. And so when he got there, he said, I know why you're here. Philip came to the hospital to visit Lewis, and when he was about to leave, he asked if there was anything that he could do for him. And Lewis said that he would like something to read. Philip had seen the aftermath of Hiroshima, and so he worked throughout the night with workmen from the machine shop that was connected to the lab in order to create a device that would allow a person with no use of their hands to read and turn pages. By 6:30 p.m., Lewis's left hand had become red and swollen, and his thumb had a numb, tingling sensation, and the nail bed had turned black. After 24 hours, the skin on his left hand looked like it was about to burst. It was so swollen. And his right hand was starting to swell up and get red as well as his abdomen that had been closest to the core. And this was extremely painful, so he was given ice packs and morphine. Besides this, he seemed to be doing well. He appeared cheerful and he had stopped vomiting. A group of chemists, biologists, and physicists worked tirelessly to figure out the dosages that everyone received, and they estimated that everyone should be okay except for Lewis. And this wasn't really known at the time, but Lewis had entered what is called the walking ghost phase, which is a period of time where people seem like they're going to be okay after radiation exposure, but the truth is that the radiation had destroyed their cells' DNA. And so those cells are no longer able to replace themselves. And so there will be no healing. And once the living cells die, it leads to system failure. By Wednesday night, blisters started forming on Lewis's left thumb, and soon his whole hand was covered in huge blisters, and the swelling had gone up into his arms, and both of these arms had been within that blue glow, and they were essentially cooked. On Thursday, the Army decided that they needed to make a press release about the accident, and they were initially not going to mention radiation at all because they wanted to avoid hysteria. But Philip threatened to go to the press himself if they did not release that the victims had been exposed to radiation. So the Army did mention that they were exposed to radiation, but they said that their condition was satisfactory. And because Lewis appeared to be doing okay at that time, this wasn't necessarily a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. After the press release, Lewis was able to contact his family and let them know that he had been in an accident. And he had planned to visit them after some testing before he left Los Alamos. And he let them know that he was going to be hospitalized for some time. So maybe they could come and see him. And so arrangements were made for his parents to come and visit him at the hospital. By Thursday night, the morphine wasn't stopping the pain, and so they encased both his hands and his left arm in ice. And this essentially acted like an amputation without giving him the trauma of amputation. But besides this, Lewis seemed to be comfortable, and he was still alert and had a good appetite, and he was receiving daily blood transfusions, and people would line up at the clinic to donate blood. And some of his colleagues' wives would also get flowers for his room. That Saturday, Philip picked up Lewis's parents from the airport, and they had been kind of under the impression that Lewis was going to be okay. Lewis kind of downplayed his situation to them. But Israel told Philip the reason that he had decided to come. He said, "Lewis is my oldest son, and every father loves his son. But there is more than that. There is respect for Lewis, for a learned man." Lewis was sitting up to greet them when they arrived, and Israel asked how he was doing, and then Lewis asked him why he didn't speak in Yiddish, saying that there was nothing to be ashamed of. Lewis made light of his situation again, saying that it was just a bit of a burn, but when Sonia touched his hair, she felt that it was stiff and dry like wire, and she just knew that there was something wrong, there was something off. And so after the visit, she hesitantly asked Philip where she could get some whiskey. A doctor from Chicago also arrived that day. He had worked with irradiated animals, and he had some success with the late stage of hemorrhaging with a dye called toluidine blue. And so he came to see if that would be a viable option for Lewis. But on Sunday, when Anna Mae Dickey, the nurse who cared for Lewis, took his blood samples and did his white blood cell count, she burst into tears. His count had plummeted, meaning that his body was no longer producing white blood cells. And it became apparent that whatever his dosage was, it was too much. So Alvin, who was in the same room as Lewis up to that point, was moved to another room so that Lewis and his parents could have some privacy. Lewis had a gold-capped tooth, and he noticed that his tongue against it was ulcerating, and so he knew that this was also a bad omen because it meant that the dose that he received was high enough to make his tooth radioactive enough that it was causing ulceration. After this, Lewis's condition deteriorated rapidly. His temperature and pulse rose, and his gastrointestinal system started to shut down. His stomach was distended, and he had to be suctioned from a nasal tube to get the fluids out of his stomach. And all of his skin turned this deep, angry, reddish-brown puce color. On Tuesday, so a week after the accident, the platelets in his blood dropped drastically, and this was a sure sign of the hemorrhagic phase, and Lewis knew what that meant. And he started suffering periods of mental confusion. By Wednesday, he was in delirium, and his lips turned blue, and he was placed in an oxygen tent. By that night, Wednesday night, he was in a coma. And then the next day, Thursday, May 30th, he died at 11 a.m. Given Lewis's unique death, experts wanted to do an autopsy on him. This went against the family's religion and tradition, but when they asked Israel about it, he said that he would be criticized for it when he got back to Winnipeg, but that Lewis had been a scientist his entire life, and that when it could do him no harm, it would be wrong to prevent him from adding to knowledge. It was determined that his immediate cause of death was aspiration of fluids from the stomach after failure of his reflexes and general weakness. He was in the early stages of hemorrhaging, just like the platelet count had led them to believe. And the organs in his abdomen were severely swollen and heavily damaged. And he was described as having a 3-dimensional sunburn. There was no sign of infection or other complications, so it was only the effects of radiation that ended his life. And it's now estimated that Lewis received 4 times what is considered a lethal dose in sieverts. The Army stripped a plane, bolted in a sofa, and flew Lewis's parents and his body in a regular coffin back to Winnipeg. And over 2,000 people attended his funeral. The idea endorsed by Alvin, Lewis was hailed a hero for his quick actions in ending the reaction and using himself as a shield, though Raymer came out decades later and said that Lewis endangered them all by using improper and unsafe procedures in the first place. Alvin and Dwight also suffered from acute radiation sickness following the event, but they recovered, and the others were further away and received lesser dosages than they did, so they recovered as well. Though radiation does have long-term effects, Alvin suffered from neurological and vision problems after this, and by January 28, 1948, Alvin, Samuel, and Theodore all sought compensation for damages, and Alvin settled his claim for $3,500. 3 of the observers later died from conditions known to be promoted by radiation. Alvin died 20 years later at 55 from a heart attack. Marion died 19 years later at 42 from leukemia. And Dwight died 29 years later at 83 from aplastic anemia and bacterial infection of the heart lining. After the accident, all hands-on criticality testing was ended and was instead done remotely using machines with the operator a safe distance away. Raymer wrote a memo with recommendations on how to prevent accidents like this from happening again, and many of his recommendations are used as a basis for nuclear criticality safety today. Rufus was renamed the Demon Core. It had been planned to be used in the Able detonation of the Crossroads series of nuclear testing, but after this incident, it needed time to cool, so it was rescheduled for later use in the series, but then the series was canceled, and so it was melted down and used in a later core. From 1948 to 1962, the Lewis A. Slotin Memorial Fund existed in his honor, supporting lectures in physics. It was initiated by his colleagues at Los Alamos and the University of Chicago. And in 2002, an asteroid discovered in 1995 was named 12423 Slotin in his honor. This event has been depicted in Dexter Masters' 1955 novel, The Accident, and in 1989, the film Fat Man and Little Boy, and in 2001, a play, The Lewis Slotin Sonata. Sometimes it seems our world loses sympathy for people who die when their death is a result of their actions. It becomes this idea that they deserved their death because they were doing something stupid or careless. Everyone makes mistakes or has a lapse of judgment or slips, We are all guilty of human error. And while it's good to recognize that what happened to them is a result of their actions, I just think it's callous to think that they don't deserve sympathy because of that they don't deserve sadness at their death because of that. Lewis was highly regarded and well-liked. He was loved by so many people. I mean, 2,000 people showed up to his funeral. He made a mistake and he paid the ultimate price for it, but he still did the best thing he could have done in that situation and prevented the other people from suffering his same fate. He deserves the criticism, but he also deserves the respect. He was still a person. So that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.